Jesus in chapter 5 spent a lot of time talking about that idea of the kingdom's character and the idea of excelling beyond what would be considered reasonable expectations. From a worldly standpoint, what Jesus calls us to do in this chapter, again, it's not new, as we talked about. There's nothing that Jesus describes here that is not found in the law of Moses, in the Old Testament. This is the way they should have been living to begin with, and yet they'd kind of drifted away from that. So he calls them back to a new standard, the idea that you need to be perfect, as he says, as your Father in heaven is perfect. And that's a daunting task. But it's a new standard, and our tendency is to look at that and say, well, I can't be that good. And so we look at like what we talked about in chapter 5, turning the other cheek. Well, yeah, I get that, but I can't reasonably expect it to do that all the time. So every once in a while, God just needs to understand that I'm just going to do this, and that's just the way it's going to be. But Jesus talks about the idea that we can't be content with what's reasonable, what we see in others around us. And that idea of looking at others around us kind of leads into chapter 6. He's going to talk about the idea of our motivation. And we talked about this last week. We got into the idea of what is it that I value in this life? What is it that motivates me to act? He talked about it in verses 19 through 24, as we talked about last week. He started off, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Don't lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. Don't be focused on the things of this life, the things that don't have any permanent, eternal value. Whether it's what we're going to talk about this morning, which is the idea of the praise of the men around you, the praise of the people who are watching you be religious. It's a meaningless thing in the context of eternity, as are the treasures, the wealth that we try to amass during this life. The idea that if that's what I value, those things aren't going to be around forever. They're going to go away. Seeking those things that are eternal in nature. The idea of how I see my life and my place in it. Do I look around and do I look at things through a temporal lens, or do I look at it through a spiritual and eternal lens? Seeing what is valuable, seeing what's not, seeing what is pure, seeing what is godly, and looking at myself as a child of God, as a servant of God, rather than someone who is a citizen of this world. And then ask the question, who am I truly serving? Am I in this life to please myself? And if I can get God in the process, that's great. Am I living a life where I try to do my best to make sure that what I want and what God wants overlap so that I can do both? Or am I looking at it, first of all, and saying, I'm going to seek God first. I'm going to be God's servant. And if it happens that I gain things materially out of that, then that's fine. But that's not what I'm going to be looking for. That's not where my focus is going to be. And that's a pretty challenging thing. And as we talked about last week, I wanted to kind of get into that first to set that mindset and to kind of talk, because I think what Jesus does a lot of times, we see these sermon outlines that are kind of like they start big and they focus down into the main point, and then they kind of come back out the other end. And that's in a lot of ways what chapter 6 is. And those 5 verses are really the focal point of this chapter. So with that in mind, I want to spend some time looking at the discussions that Jesus gives about practicing your righteousness before other people in chapter 6. I'm going to skip through. We're not going to talk about the Lord's Prayer today. I want to, Lord willing, I think that's what I'm probably going to talk about next week. And I think the idea of prayer deserves its own lesson. And frankly, we were talking about this the other day, of what things we've talked about and what we need to talk about. And prayer is one of those things that I think we probably don't spend nearly as much time teaching about and preaching about. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, Lord willing, next week. But for now, if you want to read with me over in Matthew chapter 6, we'll read the first 8 verses, and then we're going to skip down to verses 16 through 18. So beginning in verse 1, Jesus says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your gift may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogue and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you do pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then like this. And he goes on, of course, and gives this what we would consider a model prayer. He skips down to verse 16, and we say, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their face that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fastings may not be seen by others, but by your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. You know, I think Jesus in chapter 6 really points to some pretty, I think some pretty dangerous aspects of our life and our relationship to God. This idea, as he says, of doing your works of righteousness or your piety, or the King James translates this alms, but the word here is the same word that he used in a number of examples, like when he goes and John the Baptist is going to baptize him, and he says, let's do this to fulfill all righteousness. It's the same word. It's the idea of being righteous. And so when he talks about this idea, as the ESV translates it, practicing your righteousness, you know, the idea that you're going to be doing things as a result of your service to God. And in the process of that, I think for whatever reason, God's people have always been susceptible in one way or another to what Jesus is going to warn us about in chapter 6. And you know, as I think about that, I guess it's a reflection, a way of how Satan works in the world. You know, we think about Satan really desperately trying to keep us from entering into the kingdom and putting all these roadblocks in the way and all these distractions. But he doesn't give up once we get in there. There's more that he can do, and sometimes it's almost as if that's where his work really begins. And if he can find something that he can exploit, then that's what he's going to do. And one of the greatest things that he can exploit is the law itself. The idea that God calls you to do things. God calls you to worship. God calls you to do these religious acts. How can Satan use those? Well, the answer is I can use those by distorting the way you look at them and distorting why you value them, what it is that's important to you. You know, and I think it's been the same from the very beginning. We see a history in God's people of this idea of hypocritical worship. This idea of whether it be the idea that I'm worshiping it, but I don't really believe it, but I'm just going through the motions and putting on a fake face. You know, that's the word hypocrisy, comes from that idea of being an actor, pretending to be something that I'm not. But sometimes what it is not so much that I'm pretending to be something that it's not, is that I'm believing that I am something that I'm not. Because I can kind of fool myself. If I do all these things, if I act in a certain way, I can kind of kid myself into thinking that all these other things don't really matter. And I think that's really, in a lot of ways, what was going on. I don't know that necessarily a lot of the Jews, some of the Jews may have been secretly non-believers or whatever, but I think for the most part, what it really was is they had created a sense of righteousness about themselves that was not warranted. And that allowed them to ignore these other things that they were doing because they justified themselves by saying, but I'm so good in these other areas. I'm so important to God. You know, it's the idea of the Pharisees standing up in the temple and saying, I thank God that I'm not like these other people. How valuable I am to God, that God would have someone like me. You know, where does that come from? Well, it comes from this gradual idea that the more that I do and the more that I focus on what I do, the more value I put in that. And I start to use those to kind of judge myself and say, well, you know, I do a lot of things. I do a lot of really good things in the name of God. And I start to see myself in a very different way. You know, when Jesus describes the Pharisees over in Matthew 23, he talks about the idea that they do their deeds to be seen of others. They make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the places of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogue and greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by others. You know, as Jesus says here, they have their reward. And maybe it's because, you know, when you look at chapter 5 and you look at the way that we are called to live, there's not a lot of short-term, I don't say benefits, rewards that we see there. There's going to be a lot of suffering. There's going to be a lot of difficulty. There's going to be a lot of abuse that we're going to take. And there's not going to be a lot of turnabout where I can look and see tangibly, am I really getting anything out of this? And sometimes I wonder if our urge is to kind of fuel the tank, if you will, But at least I can get some recognition while I'm doing this. At least if I'm going to suffer, at least maybe people will recognize that and see that as being valuable. And at least maybe I get a pat on the back. Maybe as the preacher, at least maybe I can get somebody to shake my hand and say, good sermon on the way out. Maybe if I can at least get that. Or whatever it might be. Some idea that recognition kind of holds me over. And it's an innate human need, but what happens a lot of times is we start chasing that. Because that's the thing that we can see. I can't see that God is rewarding me. I can't see the treasures that are being laid up for me in heaven, but I can see it when people look at me and say, boy, that's a really spiritual person. That person's setting such a great example. I want to be like them. I want to listen to what they have to say. That's the danger. And I guess probably more so maybe for those who are in public roles, but we see that in our private roles as well. The idea of, and as Jesus goes through this story, and we see these three examples, these are the three, what they're considered the three basic marks of Jewish piety. The idea of alms, the idea of fasting, and the idea of praying. And we see how Jesus characterizes what's going on. He talks about this idea of giving alms that, when they come, they do it to be seen of men. They're gonna go by the collection area and they're gonna make this great presentation, this great flourish so that everyone can see. Because the poor person that I'm helping can't do anything for me. But maybe at least I can be elevated in the minds of people who see it. Maybe at least I can get something out of this, some return for the money that I'm giving away to these people. I see the idea of praying on the street corner. And I'm not sure exactly there's probably different ideas of what this could be going on, but I almost get the impression of somebody who is a Jew who is walking to the temple with everybody else, but I just can't wait him to get to the temple. I'm going to pray right now. I want to pray now. And the idea that once I get to the temple, I'm just one of thousands of people praying. But here, I stand out. So I can stand and pray, and now people will look at me. And it's not like today, if I did that on Times Square, people look at you and think you're an idiot or think you're crazy or something like that. But there, the idea of what a pious religious man he is. Look how he cares. Look how he wants to please God. Look how he's abounding in his prayers. And look how beautifully he prays. I call attention to myself through those things. And the idea of fasting. Look how pious he is. Look how dedicated he is. Look at how concerned he is about sin. Look at how much he's suffering. In that culture, I think, from what I understand, the idea of outward expressions of sorrow was ingrained in the culture. The idea of rending your garments as almost a ceremony, or it's just what you did. It was an expression that I am upset, that I'm angry, or that I'm mournful, or whatever it is. So there was this idea already that if I'm going to be in this state of mourning, I need to make sure that I'm displaying it some way. And it had gotten to the point where now, if I'm going to fast, I need to go around and I need to make sure that, that my garments, you can see where I've been kneeling. I've got dirt all over me because I'm not concerned about my appearance. And I want to make sure that you understand that. I want to make sure that you see that I'm hungry, that I'm depriving myself of some way. That's the attitude that they were having. And it's no wonder that when people today think about religion, a lot of times this is what they think about. This idea of outwardly showing your religion, outwardly showing your piety, making sure that everybody knows what kind of person you are, or maybe what kind of person you aren't. Maybe this is for the purpose of covering things up and being more, and trying to look more spiritual than you are. As a result of that, a lot of people have kind of gone to the extreme and said, well, that's what religion is. It's an outward manifestation. We do these observances in order to look righteous, to make each other feel as if we've done something good to God. And so and what we need to do is we just need to stop doing those things because those don't have any value. We kind of go to the other extreme a lot of times. But and that's why, of course, when you look at the definitions of religion and how people define religion, even in the religious world, it's often defined as hypocrisy, of empty obedience. In a lot of ways, that's really what Jesus is discussing here in chapter 6. As he does in much of the Gospels, he's warning us of the dangers of hypocritical worship. It comes up over and over in his ministry, but it's important not to miss the point that very clearly in chapter 6, Jesus has an expectation that we will be doing works of righteousness. You're going to be doing these things. Because righteousness by itself, righteousness doesn't work in a vacuum. It produces works. It produces fruits. And that wouldn't have been a confusing concept to the Jews that day at all. Psalm 106, verse 3, the psalmist writes, "Blessed are they who observe justice, who do righteousness at all times." Righteousness was not just an inward quality. As Jesus talks to his disciples over in John 15. Oh, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. In John 15, verse 8, when he tells them that by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. That's how we know. Now, again, this isn't saying that if I do these works, that means that I must be a disciple. But what it does mean is that if you're not doing those works, if those works of righteousness are not manifest in your life, then something's missing. They should be a natural outgrowth of who you are. Now, the problem was in chapter 6, that they weren't a natural outgrowth of who they were. They were a natural outgrowth of what they wanted to accomplish, how they wanted people to see them. But we're told, it shouldn't be any surprise, the idea of giving alms. We are to be a people who give. We are to be a people who bless other people. James 1:27 defines that idea of pure and undefiled religion is what? To visit the orphans and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unstained from the world. Galatians 6:9 through 10, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially to those who are the household of faith. And Paul here is not talking about the idea that if I give money in the collection plate, that's my good doing for the week. He's talking about the fact that as I go about my life, when I have an opportunity, when I see somebody that has a need, what do I do about that? Christian character, godly character demands that I'm going to act on that. He says we're going to be praying. It goes without saying that God's people should be a praying people. We'll talk about this a little bit more again next week. But we're called to pray without ceasing. In 1 Thessalonians 5:17. I had somebody, I guess, he gave a definition that at one point I thought was kind of dodging the question, but I understood it as time went on. He said that, praying without ceasing just means don't stop praying. Well, yeah, that's true. That doesn't really answer the question, because we look at this and we go, well, what does that mean? Do I need to be constantly praying and I have one long prayer 24 hours a day? Or does it mean, as some people have argued, that, well, we need to be in a prayerful state of mind, that whatever I'm doing, I'm communicating with God in one way. And maybe there's some truth to that. But I think the point is simply, we need to be always praying. Praying it's kind of like eating. I don't stop eating. That doesn't mean I eat 24 hours a day, but it means that I'm continuing to eat when the need is. I need to be praying regularly. Praying is a part of my life. Is Philippians 4:16. Do not be anxious for anything. In prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. That ought to be, again, a flow out of my faith in God, that I'm compelled to pray for the things that I need. I'm compelled to pray out of thanksgiving for all that God has done for me. And then we get to fasting. Okay, the fasting is the hard one. And I thought about spending more time on this, and I decided that I'd kind of just do like about 3 minutes, and I'll give you my thoughts on this. But clearly, I think the thing that we have to understand, first of all, is that it would have been expected of Jesus' audience that they were fasting. Jesus does not command them to fast, but he accepts the fact that they are going to be fasting. And we know that the Jews were commanded on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. They were to afflict their souls. The idea that they were going to fast. They were going to spend their time mourning their sins. And we see as time has gone on, different ideas of fasting have taken hold. The Pharisees of Jesus' day would fast twice a week. It's something they did regularly as a matter of course, and as we see here, as a matter of pride. They made sure everybody knew that they were fasting. Made sure that it wasn't a secret at all. But we also see even Jewish Christians fasting from time to time. And typically as Christians fasted, it seems to be as Paul and Barnabas and the brethren in Antioch were fasting and praying in preparation for his mission trip. When Peter was in prison, they were fasting and praying together. There were times when they had their petitions of God, and they were urgent in need, and they were fasting and praying as a result of that. This wasn't a dietary fast. They fasted because they wanted to focus their minds on things that are spiritual. And so the question then is, well, should we be fasting today? And I struggle with this a little bit. But the thing that I keep coming back to is a passage over in Matthew chapter 9. This is a question, if you remember, that Jesus is asked. And his response, I think, is telling. It says that the disciples of John came to him saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? So right off the bat, Jesus' disciples are not fasting. And that tells us something. And his response to them is, his response to them is, can a wedding guest mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. There's this idea that fasting isn't something you do just to do it. You do it because you're compelled to do it. It comes out of your state of mind. I don't fast to create a state of mind. My state of mind creates the fast. That's the way it's supposed to work. And we see that that's exactly not what was happening in Jesus' time. But Jesus responds. He makes another statement over in John chapter 16. If you want to turn to John 16, this is something that he's talking to his disciples as he's preparing them for the time that he's going to be crucified. And he says, in a little while, you will see me no longer. And again, a little while, you will see me. Some of his disciples said to one another, what is it that he says? A little while, and you will not see me. And again, a little while, and you will see me. And because I am going to the Father. So they were saying, what does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he's talking about. And Jesus knew that they wanted to ask him. So he said to them, is this what you're asking yourself? What I mean by saying a little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me? Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. So it skips down to verse 22. So also you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. And I wonder a little bit. Jesus, I don't think is talking about fasting here, but there's a principle that I think makes sense here. Jesus says from the beginning, you don't fast when the bridegroom is with you. Why would you fast? You have what you've been promised. This is all that God has given you. It's manifest before you. You have every blessing that God could possibly ask. Why? You have redemption of your sins. Why would you need to fast? And it almost sounds like in John 16, he says, there's going to be a point where you will fast. Why? Because the Son of Man is going to be taken away. He's going to be on the cross. You're going to be despondent. You're going to be lost. You're going to think, what am I doing? What do we do next? You're not going to know what to do. But he says that will be turned into joy. And so I wonder whether the point here, maybe the takeaway for us might be that if there's something in my life that I need to be fasting about, then maybe I ought to fast. But as a general course of my life, how much am I blessed? Am I in a fasting state of mind? I've been cleansed of my sins by the blood of Christ. I am in a covenant relationship with God. Those are wonderful blessings. And it's hard for me to feel mournful in that context. Now, if I've got sin in my life that needs to be dealt with, maybe that's the time for fasting. Maybe there are times like with the disciples that when there's something in my life and I got to make a really important decision, I want to make sure that I'm focused spiritually. And I want God's blessings and I want God's guidance. Maybe that's the time for me to fast. But the idea, I don't think, is that fasting, I don't think, needs to be a part of our regular life. Nor do I think it should. And again, somebody may have a different idea on that. And a lot of this is judgment. But I do think it's telling that we have commands throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament about giving. I know that I'm supposed to be giving. God tells me to give. I have commands to pray. God tells me to pray. But we don't have any commands to fast. So that's, again, does that mean that we shouldn't? I don't know, but it's telling, and I think it's worth considering when we think about that. But again, it's a decision I think that everybody needs to come about on their own. But the important thing for this passage, whatever we understand about our own fasting and our own position on that, the idea is that the Jews in Jesus' day did fast. And Jesus expected that they would. If only for doing it once a year on the Day of Atonement when it was commanded. He says, when you do it, this is the attitude that don't be like the Pharisees are doing it. Don't be the ones going around and amplifying your suffering for the people around. I was thinking about that. We have a thing called, most of you probably heard the idea of a humble brag. The idea I'm gonna make sure, I'm gonna tell you how tough a time I'm having in the same way that I'm gonna show you how really well I'm doing. I don't know, I got this new car and it's great, but boy, when I got it up to 150, it really started to shake a little bit. I don't know. It's just, but I really, it kind of got old when all these people were looking at it and turning their heads, and that just was embarrassing to me. You see how that kind of works. That's what's going on here. The idea of, oh, woe is me. Look how tormented I am. Look how difficult look how hard I'm being on myself because I'm righteous. That was the attitude that they had. And that's kind of a tendency that we, again, the Facebook is, and social media is a testament to the fact that we still do that today. We tell each other, we tell people how hard how difficult things are, really for the point of elevating ourselves in the eyes of others. So anyway, so I think we see those tendencies. Because as Christians and as people in general, I think we are, as we talked about earlier, we're drawn in some ways to this idea of hypocritical worship, because we need that short-term encouragement to the point sometimes that we start to value it more than anything else. And even in the Lord's church, I worry about this sometimes, because I think that we often run the danger of doing exactly what these brethren were doing, in that they were looking at the deeds, the works of righteousness as an end of themselves, to the point where, if I do these things, that must mean I'm right with God. If I'm the person, how many times do we think of instances where we will describe a brother in Christ and say, yeah, that's a faithful brother. Based on what? Well, he's there every Sunday. I know he's faithful. That's how we define it a lot of times. Now, that is not a biblical definition of what it means to be a faithful Christian, but it's the easiest, it's the superficial way to do it, because because I can't read his heart. I don't know what he's like in person, but all I can do is kind of judge him on this. And so I think we all understand what we mean by that. We would like to make the assumption that he's doing everything the rest of the week that would indicate the reason that he's coming to worship with us on Sunday. But sometimes we just kind of stop there, and we just judge people on that. And if somebody's not as regular in their attendance, well, they just must not be as devoted. They must not be as faithful. And maybe they're not. But there's a lot more going on than that. When we think about being involved in the worship, we think about the idea of how we don't have any, well, we got one young boy, and we got one that's kind of young, but not really. But, and we think about how we want to get them, how we want to raise and encourage them. And what we want to do is we want to get them up and get them to do things in a visible way in the Lord's church. Because if we do that, that's going to encourage them. And sometimes I think we can sometimes send the message, that's what being a Christian is about. It's about standing up in front of people and doing things that will be recognized as being righteous. We have to be real careful about that. The idea that we are not to do these things to be seen of men. Because, the reality is that I think a lot of times we can judge our worth in a local congregation based on what we get to do. What works am I allowed to do in public? And if I'm not on the roster, we don't have that problem here. We pretty much we got people just, please don't make me do something today. It's everything. But when you're in a group of 200 or 300 people, and all of a sudden, it may be a month before I ever even lead a prayer, how do I feel about that? Well, I can do a whole lot better than that guy. Why don't they ask me? Why don't they ever ask me to lead singing? I can do a good job. Have you ever had brethren that have talked about that from the standpoint, I want to go somewhere where I can be of use? And that's a great attitude. But sometimes what we mean by that is, I want to go someplace where they'll let me lead singing. I want to go someplace where I'll get to speak, because I got a lot to say. And I think people ought to hear it. That is a danger that we have. When we look at these things and we don't remind ourselves, as Jesus reminds us, that we need to be looking at what we're doing. We need to be doing these things. Look, if I can lead singing, lead singing. If you can lead prayer, lead a prayer. If you can give a lesson, give a lesson. You need to be doing those things. Those have value, but they don't have any value if the only reason I'm doing it is so that I can feel that I've accomplished something for God. We have to be very careful of that mindset. And Jesus reminds us of that. And I kind of skipped over the idea of praying, I think, because he actually adds one more thing in prayer. I'll go back to prayer real quick. Because he talks about this idea of praying. He first of all starts about the idea of don't use vain repetitions. Don't just, don't just kind of get up here and talk and speak. And the word that is used there, the Greek word, is the word for babble. The idea of giving, it's not so much on the repetition as it is the meaningless of what you're saying. You're just kind of saying things to take up space. If we ever felt like that, I know we've all heard brethren who get up and give a public prayer, and seems like they're focused on the idea that I really need to be up here praying for 5 minutes. And so I need to find 5 minutes of things to pray about. And it involves a lot of repetition. It involves a lot of filler, a lot of flowery language. And we ask ourselves, well, this is not how this person talks. This is vocabulary they never use in regular life. Why are they using that? We have kind of a prayer lexicon sometimes in terms of the way that we talk to God publicly. And it's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, am I using phrases that just have no more meaning to me anymore? I'm not exaggerating when I say I remember a brother that I could come with about 10 index cards of phrases, and I could arrange them in any given order, and I could word for word give you his prayer. It was just a question of what order he was going to say them in. But there was nothing in it that was original in terms of me thinking about in the moment what I want to talk to God about. And when we get to that point, what have we really done? We're making vain repetitions. We're saying things that don't mean anything because we're not speaking to God. And again, we'll talk about prayer next week. The idea of simply coming to God with our requests, with what we need, with what we want God to know, as opposed to speaking in a way that people will come away saying, that was a really good prayer. That was a really heartfelt prayer. It was so beautifully worded. That's not to say we can't have beautifully worded prayers. But why are we doing it? What are we focused on? So when we talk about, as Jesus talks about this idea of acceptable worship, and I probably kind of jumped around in my notes a little bit. I struggled with how I was going to organize this one, and Laura will attest that I just kept moving things around, and I wasn't sure what needed to go where, so I'm probably not sticking with my notes very well. But he talks about this idea of giving and praying and fasting, and he says, when you give, what does he say? Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Now, the point of this isn't that we can't ever give in a way that somebody might notice. The fact that we're giving in the collection plate, at some point somebody's probably going to notice that. We think of the example of Barnabas in Acts 4, who comes and lays the proceeds from his real estate selling at the apostles' feet. Clearly this was a public thing that he did. Now, the difference was Barnabas didn't get on his phone and call his friends and say, hey, look, everybody, about 4:30, I'm going to be down at the temple, and you probably want to go see this. Is going to be really cool. And make sure to, and get on there, and then we're going to post on social media and let everybody know, hey, we just had a great thing happen at the temple. We just did this. It was fantastic. And no praise to me, glory to God, but it was a lot of money. That's the idea. That's what he's trying to avoid. There may be times when our giving is public just simply because it has to be public. But that's not a reason not to give. The idea is simply that your motivation isn't that somebody's going to see you give. I'm not that person that, there was that study that men tip more or more regularly when they're with their girlfriend or their wife than when they're by themselves. And there may be a lot of truth to that. The idea that I'm giving a little bit more so that I can impress somebody. Are we giving whether anybody sees it or not? Because we know that God always sees it. When I pray, as we've kind of alluded to early, the point of this is not when he says, go into your room and shut your door and pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. The point isn't that we can't pray in public. Jesus prayed in public all the time. Jesus had no problem, stopping in the middle of a lesson and just praying. I thank you, God, that you have revealed these things to these and not to the wise. Among plenty of examples where he did this. That's not the point. But he also prayed in private. He prayed when people were watching. He prayed when people weren't watching. And when he did, when Jesus stayed up all night praying about the naming of the apostles, he didn't go down to the temple and pitch a tent on the front gate and say, hey, everybody, I'm going to be here praying, and this is a really important time for me. I just want to let you all know that. He went up into the mountain by himself because the point was to focus on God, to focus his attention on spiritual things. to take those things, to be free of those distractions. As we talked about, and I skipped ahead a little bit, when you pray, to not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. You know, the idea of thinking that if I just say enough things, that God will be impressed. You know, it's not even, this is the one time where I'm actually trying to impress God, but I'm trying to impress God in a way that these people are impressed by it. Maybe God will like it too. Man, as if I could construct a prayer that was so beautifully worded, so insightful, so deep, that God would look at that and go, wow, I've never heard a prayer like that before. We often can fool ourselves into thinking that we can do something that will impress God. What impresses God is if we come to God with a broken heart and a contrite spirit and say, God, be merciful unto me, a sinner. You know, that's the man, as Jesus says, that goes back to his home justified. When you pray, and we talked about the idea of when we fast, he says, when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And again, you know, maybe we're not fasting, but maybe we're going through a difficult time. Maybe we're going through trials in our lives and troubles, and we need to reach out for help and for prayers and for support in those times. But when we do it, do we do it out of do we wear our suffering like a badge of honor? Do we look and say, look how much I'm suffering for God. Look how much they hate me. Look how much they're trying to ruin me down, but I won't do it. And I'm going to stand up and let everybody see that I am this pinnacle of one who is standing for God. And how hard it is for me to do that. Do we see people that have that attitude sometimes? You know, that's we've seen that in this COVID situation. You know, how many times have we kind of begun what we now consider to be calling it virtue signaling? The idea that I want to make sure that you know how outraged I am about this or that or whatever it might be. You know, the idea that, as we've talked about, you know, we have to obey God rather than men. We will worship however we need to worship, regardless of what the world says. But is our attitude about that like the apostles did, which is we have to obey God rather than man? All right, let's go back to work. Or do we feel the need to make a big presentation about it, call attention to everybody, have a presentation on the Capitol steps and say, we will not be oppressed in this way, and find a way to make ourselves kind of the hero in all of this? That's I guess that's the closest example I can come to this, but that's really kind of the idea that Jesus is giving here. And don't make it about yourself. Don't make it about your suffering. Make it about your relationship, your genuine state of mind before God. Because at the end of the day, who's going to judge me? You know, I'm trying to impress God. I fail way more often than I succeed. But when we remind ourselves of that, you know, this is the passage that when Paul is talking to the Corinthians in chapter 4, verse 3-4, he says, but with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. If my goal in life is to please God, the people around me, their reaction is not a barometer of whether God is pleased with what I'm doing. So why am I concerned with it? I shouldn't be. Focus on glorifying God. Because what is it that God values? You know, there's a passage in Isaiah chapter 58 where he's talking about the idea of fasting a little bit and the attitude of the people back in Isaiah's day. And as you well know, we studied the minor prophets during the divided kingdom time. And we talked a little bit about how Isaiah fit into that whole context. And the idea, these were people that were steeped in idolatry, but it wasn't as if they had turned their back on the Lord. They weren't just ignoring God. They still wanted to worship God. But the problem was they were trying to go both ways with it. And Isaiah describes this. And he says, they delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice be heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? And he goes on. You notice what he's doing there? He's not saying, you keep trying to impress me with all these things you're doing. You need to stop doing those. No, he's saying you need to do those things, but you need to do them with the right attitude. You need to do them combined with a contrite heart that seeks God's will, that seeks God's approval, that seeks God's reward. Jesus, when he talks to the Pharisees and confronts them about their own hypocrisy, he says, you are those who justify yourself, but God knows your heart. God knows who you are. The question is, and the trick for us, I think, as we talked about a little bit last week, is, do we know who we are? Are we honest about why we do what we do? Are we willing to wait for our Father, who sees in secret, who will reward us? It just says reward you. I feel like at some point there was a translation that talked about the idea that we'll reward you openly. But the reality is we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of God. And we're going to be judged based on our lives, based on our deeds. And we're all going to fall short. And Jesus is going to intercede on our behalf and say, this one is mine. And God will say, you're forgiven. Well done, good and faithful servant. We'll be exalted as he talks about. He's raised us up to sit with him on thrones in heaven. The idea that we're going to be exalted by God because of what we have done in this life. But in the meantime, we've got to wait for that. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to suffer for God today for riches tomorrow? That's our challenge. And it requires us to be honest with ourselves with what it is, as we talked about last week. What do I value in this life? And what is important enough? What is valuable enough that I'm willing to wait for it? So let's encourage each other as we go through this week and think about those things. The lesson is yours. If there's anything that you have any need of, any prayers, any requests, any help that we can do to help you to live a life that's pleasing to God, whatever we can do to help you, let us know, whether you're online, whether you're here in person, whatever it might be, as we're letting our invitation song.
Number 269.